At 25, I am the eldest child in a family that has become more of a burden than a source of love or support. Living under one roof with my parents and two younger siblings, Joseph and Katrina, have spent years carrying the weight of this household on my shoulders. While others my age are exploring life, building careers, or even starting families, I've been trapped in an endless cycle of sacrifice for people who don't seem to value me. My mother, though physically capable, chooses to live as if she's perpetually ill. She spends her days glued to the TV, stuffing herself with junk food, and complaining about how no one cares for her. The truth: her illness is self-inflicted, a way to manipulate those around her into feeling guilty. And yet, every time I tried to confront her about it, she'd cry, accuse me of being heartless, and remind me that I should feel grateful to live in her house. Then there are my siblings, Joseph and Katrina, whose irresponsibility makes the situation even worse. Joseph, my brother, isn't just lazy, he's dangerous. A thief by nature, he once got caught stealing from a supermarket. Instead of letting him face the consequences, my parents drained our savings to bail him out, leaving us drowning in debt. That incident threw our family into financial chaos. But did they learn anything? Of course not. As for Katrina, my sister, she's mastered the art of playing the victim. She constantly pretends to be mentally unstable to avoid responsibility, all while spending recklessly on clothes, makeup, and parties. Once, when we couldn't afford a designer bag she wanted, she threatened to kill herself. Naturally, my parents panicked and scrambled to get her what she demanded, further proving that nothing and no one matters more to them than keeping up appearances. Living like this has felt suffocating. Every day I wake up knowing I'll be taken advantage of, judged, or guilty. But deep down I know something has to change, or else I'll lose myself completely. Living in that house felt like being trapped in a never-ending nightmare, where my every effort was taken for granted, and my sacrifices were met with disdain. I bore the weight of 70% of our household expenses, working tirelessly to keep the family afloat, while my mother and sister lounged around as if they had no responsibilities. Katrina spent her days locked in her room or out partying, while my mother sat glued to the TV, stuffing herself with junk food. The irony. They still expected me to handle everything else: cleaning, cooking, laundry, grocery shopping, all on top of a grueling 16-hour work schedule. It wasn't just exhausting, it was. My father and brother Joseph clung to outdated gender roles, refusing to lift a finger around the house. "This is women's work," my father would say whenever I hinted at asking for help. Meanwhile, Joseph acted like he was royalty, lounging on the couch playing video games all day. How could they justify this when I was the one keeping the family from falling apart? But fairness was never part of the equation in our home. No matter how hard I worked, my siblings always came first. Katrina's birthday last month was a prime example. She got a lavish party, complete with an expensive cake, a DJ, and gifts worth thousands of dollars, all funded by my paycheck. I had to take on extra consulting jobs just to cover the costs after my dad admitted he'd miscalculated and borrowed money from dangerous people. When I confronted him about it, he dismissed my concerns, saying, "It's only once a year, only once a year." What about the countless times I sacrificed my own happiness for them? And what did I get for my birthday 2 days ago? Body wash. Freaking body wash. The worst part: during Katrina's party, she mocked my gift in front of her friends. "Wow, body wash. That's so practical," she sneered, laughing along with her clique. Her words cut deeper than any knife, leaving me humiliated and furious. Was this really how they saw me? As someone whose sole purpose was to serve them without deserving even basic recognition? And then there was the time I came home late, after a brutal 14-hour shift at work. I was physically and emotionally drained, so I told my mom I couldn't cook dinner that night. Instead of understanding, she called me selfish and accused me of neglecting the family. "Is it too much to ask for you to think of others?" she snapped. Others. Who exactly had been carrying this family for years? Every ounce of energy I had was poured into keeping us afloat, yet I was treated like the villain. The injustice of it all burned inside me, fueling a growing resentment I could no longer suppress. The body wash incident was the final blow, the moment when years of pent-up frustration and resentment finally boiled over. I couldn't take it anymore, the constant exploitation, the lack of appreciation, the blatant favoritism. That night, after my mother's dramatic tears and accusations that I was dramatic for being upset about something so valid, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every injustice in my mind. It wasn't just the gift. It was everything leading up to it. The endless sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the emotional manipulation, it all hit me like a freight train. I realized then that if I didn't make a change, I would lose myself completely. I decided that night, but freedom doesn't come cheap, especially when you've been financially tethered to a family that sees you as nothing more than an ATM. So, I started planning meticulously. Every extra dollar I earned went into savings. I worked overtime at the office, took on additional consulting gigs outside of work hours, and even skipped meals to save money. My colleagues noticed how much harder I was pushing myself, but they didn't understand why. How could they? To them, I was already successful, learning more than most people my age. What they didn't see was the suffocating weight of responsibility I carried, or the fact that 70% of my salary disappeared into a bottomless pit called family. When I finally gathered enough courage to tell my parents I was moving out, their reactions were explosive. My mother screamed that I was ungrateful, that I was abandoning the family who had given me everything. When her words failed to sway me, she resorted to theatrics, clutching her chest and collapsing onto the couch, pretending to have a heart attack. For a split second, panic gripped me. But then I remembered her pattern. This wasn't the first time she'd faked illness to manipulate someone. I stood firm, refusing to fall for her games. My father, on the other hand, exploded with anger. He accused me of betrayal, of forgetting where I came from. "How dare you leave us?" he roared. "You think you're better than your family now." His words stung, but deep down, I knew the truth. They weren't upset because they loved me. They were upset because they were losing their primary source of income. Before leaving, I discovered something that shattered whatever lingering guilt I might have felt. While going through some receipts, I found proof that the money I sent home during Katrina's party debacle hadn't been used to pay off debts or cover household expenses. Instead, it had gone toward buying her designer clothes and accessories. They had literally spent my hard-earned money on luxuries while lecturing me about sacrifice. That revelation hardened my resolve. I wasn't just leaving, and no amount of guilt-tripping or manipulation would stop me. Moving into my tiny apartment felt like stepping into a new world, a world where I was finally free, yet terrifyingly alone. The first night, after everything was unpacked, I lay on my bed for hours, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in years, no one called me to fix something or demanded that I drop what I was doing to take care of them. It was strange, almost unsettling, but also deeply cathartic. My small apartment wasn't much. It had barely any furniture, and the walls were bare, but it was mine. Every corner of it represented a hard-earned victory over the suffocating life I'd left behind. For the first time, I had space to breathe. I started meeting people outside of work, something I could never do before because every plan I made would be interrupted by some family emergency. Lisa, one of my closest friends from the office, introduced me to her cousin Jake, a kind-hearted guy who worked as a graphic designer. We went out for coffee, then dinner, and eventually, we started dating. It was surreal to have someone genuinely interested in me, not just what I could provide. I even hosted a housewarming party, inviting Janet, Lisa, and a few other colleagues. They helped me decorate the place with secondhand finds and handmade crafts. For once, I felt like I belonged somewhere. But not everything was perfect. The silence from my family during those first few weeks was deafening. At first it felt liberating. They weren't calling to guilt-trip me or demand money, but as days turned into weeks, their complete absence began to weigh on me. One night, I woke up crying, overwhelmed by a wave of loneliness. I missed the familiarity of home, even though I knew deep down that it had never truly been a loving environment. As I lay there in the dark, I realized something painful. I hadn't cried because I missed my family. I cried because I finally understood that I'd never really been loved or valued in that house. When Lisa came over the next day, she noticed my red eyes and asked what was wrong. I told her about my breakdown, and she listened quietly, holding my hand. Then she said something that hit me hard. "You know, most people your age go on vacations or take breaks to recharge. Have you ever done anything just for yourself?" Her question stunned me. No, I hadn't. Not once. While others traveled, relaxed, or pursued hobbies, I had been trapped in an endless cycle of sacrifice. Even when I earned more than my peers, I couldn't afford luxuries because 70% of my paycheck disappeared into the black hole of my family's needs. That conversation stayed with me for days. It forced me to confront the reality of how much I'd given up, not just materially, but emotionally. Yet, despite the pang of regret, this empty apartment, this quiet solitude, was the beginning of something real. And for the first time, I allowed myself to hope. It had only been a month since I moved out, and already my phone buzzed incessantly with calls from my family. At first, they were eerily silent, no texts, no messages, nothing, but now it seemed like the floodgates had opened, and all their pent-up desperation came pouring through in waves of manipulation. The first call came late one night, just as I was settling into bed after a long day at work. It was my mother, her voice trembling with what sounded like genuine panic. "If you don't send money," she sobbed, "Katrina will have no choice but to sell herself on the streets. Do you want that on your conscience?" Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, but deep down, I knew this was another one of her guilt-tripping tactics. Katrina had always been dramatic, using any excuse to get what she wanted, selling herself. Please. If anything, she'd probably find some other way to manipulate people into giving her handouts. But my mother didn't stop there. Over the next few days, the calls became relentless. My father joined in too, his tone shifting between anger and despair. One evening he called me during dinner, his voice cracking as he threatened to end his life if I didn't help them. "I can't live like this anymore," he shouted. "You've abandoned us, and now we're starving. Is this how you repay everything we've done for you?" His words stung, not because they were true, but because they revealed how little they understood about sacrifice. Starving? Really? After years of living off my hard-earned money, they had the audacity to paint themselves as victims. And then there was Joseph. According to my mother, he'd been fired again, this time for stealing from his workplace. "He's trying so hard," she pleaded, "but society won't give him a chance." Hardly. Joseph wasn't trying. He was exploiting every opportunity to avoid responsibility. And Katrina? She couldn't pay rent because, apparently, she hadn't worked a single day since I left. No surprise there. For someone who claimed to be mentally unstable, she sure managed to party every weekend without fail. Despite their pleas, I refused to budge. Every fiber of my being screamed that this was exactly what they deserved, a taste of reality without me propping them up. But it wasn't easy. Each call felt like a dagger twisting deeper into my heart, forcing me to confront the painful truth. They never had. To them, I was nothing more than a source of income, a safety net they could exploit whenever it suited them. And now that I'd cut the strings, they were flailing, desperate to reel me back in. But I wouldn't let them, not this time. It was supposed to be a peaceful Friday night, a rare moment of joy and relaxation I had earned after months of solitude and hard work. Lisa, Janet, and 2 other friends from work had come over for a cozy wine and book night. We were laughing, sharing stories, and enjoying each other's company when the first signs of trouble began. At first, it was just faint shouting outside my apartment door. I tried to ignore it, assuming it was some late-night argument in the hallway. But then the noise grew louder, angry voices, pounding footsteps, and finally, a loud knock on my door. My heart sank as I opened it to find my father, brother, and sister standing there, red-faced and fuming, with the building manager trying desperately to hold them back. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice trembling. My father pushed past me without answering, yelling that they deserved an explanation. The chaos escalated quickly. Joseph stormed into my living room, demanding money, while Katrina stood by the doorway, smirking and making snide comments about how fancy my place looked. "Why can't I live here too?" she sneered, as if moving in with me would somehow solve all her problems. I stared at her in disbelief. Did she really think I'd let someone as lazy and entitled as her ruin the life I'd worked so hard to build? Things spiraled out of control when my father started tearing through my belongings. He ripped open drawers, threw books off shelves, and smashed a vase I had bought just last week. His face was contorted with rage, and his shouts echoed through the apartment. My friends sat frozen in shock, their laughter replaced by fear. One of them whispered, "Should we call security?" But I couldn't even respond. I was paralyzed, watching years of emotional manipulation manifest into physical destruction. When my brother joined in, flipping over furniture and stomping around like a wild animal, Janet quietly slipped away to alert the building staff. By the time security arrived, the scene was catastrophic. Papers were scattered everywhere, broken glass littered the floor, and my once cozy apartment felt like a war zone. My father refused to leave, screaming that he wouldn't go until I gave him what he wanted. "You ungrateful child," he roared as the guards dragged him and Joseph out. His words cut deep, but not because they hurt. They confirmed everything I already knew. They didn't care about me. They only cared about what I could give them. As they were handcuffed and led away, my father turned to glare at me one last time, spitting out, "You're no daughter of mine." The aftermath of my family's reckless behavior hit them like a tidal wave, and I watched from a distance as their lives unraveled completely. My father, who had once acted so entitled in my apartment, was now behind bars again, this time for failing to pay the court-ordered damages he and my brother caused during their invasion. The judge had warned him that even a minor infraction would land him back in jail, and true to his word, my father's refusal to comply sealed his fate. Meanwhile, my brother Joseph wasn't faring any better. Sentenced to a year in prison for shoplifting, a crime he couldn't seem to outgrow, he quickly became a target among inmates. Word reached me through unreliable sources that he'd been beaten multiple times by other prisoners who despised thieves. It was brutal, but I felt no pity. His choices had led him here. My mother's health, predictably, spiraled out of control. Years of overeating, inactivity, and emotional manipulation had finally caught up with her. Doctors warned she was at severe risk of heart disease, yet she refused to change her ways. Living alone in the house, or what remained of it, she barely had food or medicine. One night, she called me in tears, claiming strangers were threatening her. These men, former clients of Katrina, had broken into the house demanding repayment for fraudulent deals they claimed she'd orchestrated. When she begged me for help, I hesitated. For years I had sacrificed everything for her, only to be treated as expendable. This time, I chose not to intervene. Speaking of Katrina, her descent into chaos was inevitable. Arrested for illegal drug transactions, she now awaited trial without access to a competent lawyer. Her public defender seemed indifferent, and rumors swirled that her business partners weren't pleased with how things ended. As if that weren't enough, our old house, once a symbol of dysfunction, was now unrecognizable. Vandalized and looted, it became a squatting ground for dangerous individuals tied to Katrina's shady dealings. The irony was cruel. The very people she thought would protect her turned on her when the money ran out. Watching my family crumble felt surreal. They had exploited me for years, and now, facing ruin, they expected me to save them. But I knew better. Their downfall was self-inflicted, and I refused to be dragged down with them. The house I once called home, a place filled with memories, both bitter and fleeting, had become unrecognizable. After months of neglect, it was now a shadow of its former self, overrun by strangers who had turned it into a den of chaos. The neighborhood, already notorious for crime, had devolved further into lawlessness. Squatters, former clients of Katrina's shady dealings, now occupied the crumbling structure, using it as a hideout for drug use and illegal activities. Broken windows, graffiti-covered walls, and discarded needles littered the property. It was no longer a home, it was a wasteland. Meanwhile, my mother, the woman who once sat on the couch all day indulging in junk food while blaming everyone else for her problems, was now living off scraps at a relative's house. She barely had enough to eat, let alone access to medication for her deteriorating health. One evening, my phone buzzed with an incoming message from her. "I'm starving," she wrote. "No one cares about me. I might die tonight." Her words were dramatic, as always, but this time they carried a chilling undertone of truth. For years, she had relied on others to provide for her, refusing to take responsibility for herself. Now, abandoned by the very people she enabled, she faced the consequences of her choices. But I couldn't bring myself to help. Every fiber of my being screamed that this was their doing, the result of decades of poor decisions, selfishness, and denial. My father, emaciated and defeated, remained behind bars, his pride shattered along with his freedom. Joseph, still serving his sentence, had reportedly been attacked again by fellow inmates, leaving him physically scarred and emotionally broken. And Katrina, she awaited trial in a cold cell, her public defender offering little hope for redemption. Their lives were unraveling, and there was nothing I could or would do to stop it. As I stared at my mother's desperate plea, a wave of conflicting emotions washed over me. Part of me wanted to rush to her side, to save her from the abyss she had created. But another part, stronger and more resolute, reminded me of the countless times I had sacrificed everything only to be treated as expendable. This was their reality now, a grim culmination of their actions. I deleted the message without responding. They had made their bed, and it was time for them to lie in it. The weight of my past no longer anchors me to the chaos I once endured, but it still lingers in the corners of my mind like a shadow I can't quite shake. There are moments when I feel an overwhelming sense of relief, freedom from the suffocating grip of responsibility that had defined my life for so long. For the first time, I wake up without dreading what awaits me at home. No frantic calls demanding money, no guilt trips about being selfish, and no endless chores waiting to consume my energy. But with this newfound freedom comes a strange mix of emotions. At times I catch myself feeling sorry for them, their lives spiraling out of control, while mine slowly rebuilds itself. My mother's deteriorating health, my father's imprisonment, and my siblings' reckless choices haunt me more than I care to admit. One night I had a dream so vivid, it felt real. I was back in that crumbling house, surrounded by familiar faces, twisted with anger and blame. My father screamed at me for abandoning them. My mother sobbed uncontrollably, accusing me of betrayal, and my siblings glared at me as if I were the root of all their misfortunes. "You left us to rot," they shouted in unison, their voices echoing through the empty halls. The air was heavy with resentment, and I could barely breathe under the pressure of their accusations. When I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, I realized it wasn't just a nightmare, it was a warning. A reminder of why I made the decision to leave in the first place. Despite these lingering doubts, I know deep down that I did the right thing. Their problems are not mine to solve. They've spent years refusing to take responsibility for their actions, and now they must face the consequences. Every time I think about stepping back into their world, even out of pity, I remind myself of how far I've come. That dream became a turning point, reinforcing the importance of boundaries. I refuse to let guilt drag me back into a toxic cycle, where I'm nothing more than a lifeline for people who never truly valued me. This is my life now, and I owe it to myself to protect it. This journey taught me one undeniable truth. Boundaries are not just important, they're essential. For years, I let my family take advantage of me because I thought love meant sacrifice. But love shouldn't cost you your soul. Leaving wasn't easy. It felt like tearing myself apart from a part of my identity. Yet, staying would have destroyed me completely. I realized that no matter how much I wanted to save them, I couldn't force someone to change if they didn't want to. My siblings' reckless choices and my parents' enabling behavior were reflections of their own failures, not mine. In the end, I wrote them a letter of final act of closure. "I am no longer your ATM," I wrote, my hands trembling with both anger and relief. "You've treated me as nothing more than a source of money, and now you must face the consequences of your actions. I hope this hardship teaches you what I tried to for years: responsibility." The letter ended with a prayer not for forgiveness, but for self-awareness. As I sealed the envelope, I felt a weight lift off my chest. They may never understand why I left, but that no longer mattered. What mattered was that I had finally reclaimed my life.